All right, good evening and welcome to the latest episode of Pop Go the Writers. Tonight I am joined by my
Horst.
co-host as usual, Paul Storrie.
Guten
Also,
Tag.
also we have two lovely guests this evening. We have I'm told from Canada, Stephanie Cooke
Hello.
and America's Thom Zahler. So I will
Hello.
take a moment and let you guys introduce yourself for those who haven't met you yet. We'll start with Stephanie.
Hey, so I am a writer and editor based in Canada. I'm the only Canadian whatsoever that does this. Thus, I am Canada's one and only Stephanie Cooke. I released a middle grade book earlier this year called Oh My Gods, a graphic novel more specifically. I have another called Paranorthern coming out in July, which I'm really excited about. And in my spare time, I edit comics and find some time to sleep.
Sleep. That's the thing I keep forgetting.
Yeah.
That might explain the pneumonia, Dan.
That probably would explain the pneumonia, yeah. Because nothing else sure did. All right. Mr. Zahler, would you tell the folks about yourself, please?
Oh, sure. Well, I'm a writer, artist, letterer. I kind of do everything myself because I'm the only person I know who will work for my own crappy rates. I'm probably best known for doing Love and Capes, a superhero romantic comedy, and working on an obscure little art project called My Little Pony, which I write and draw covers for and write stories for IDW. Along the way, I've done a couple things for Webtoons, did a story called Warning Label, did a story called Keep Its Arrows, did a story about a magical time-traveling winery for IDW called Time and Vine, and then I got to write my wine bills off for a year because I'm a super genius. And I write, I keep putting America's Thom Zahler down because Paul and my friend Mark Nathan, who runs Baltimore Comic Con, named me that at some point, and it just kind of stuck.
Did you do something between going live and change on your sound? Because you're getting a kind of a garbled.
No, does this sound better?
Mm.
I'll see. Let me see.
Okay, well, he plays with that. Mr. Storrie, you said you had something you can hype now.
What? No, I did not receive my comics of Justice League Unlimited Girl Power, which features Justice League Unlimited number 20, drawn by Rick Burchett, and this cover actually came from Justice League 20, and it is by Ty Templeton. But I don't have that. It's not out July 6th. Wait, no, it is. I'm very happy.
So does this sound any better, by the way?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So thank you all. But let me give you a little setup of what I wanted to talk about tonight. Was as Paul mentioned, surprisingly came down with pneumonia and had my first overnight stay in a hospital in my entire life, and been spending all week trying to relax, take it easy, things I'm not very good at. But while doing so, I came across on, I want to say it was Hulu, might have been Prime, Chris Claremont's X-Men was a documentary about his time on the X-Men. And I started thinking about how much his work kind of influenced my own writing and stuff like that. And then started thinking about influences altogether on writers and who our influences are. And I thought it would be an interesting way to have a chat about just who your influences were, the types of things that fed into your creative work. So I thought we'd kind of go around and talk about that. But I wanted to start with, what were some of the first novels you read as a kid for fun? I mean, we all have the books that we're forced to read. I'm sure we probably all read Catcher in the Rye because for some reason people think that's a good book. Yeah, things like that. But for me, going with my mom to the used bookstore and she'd be going through looking at all the romance stuff, I found myself over picking up either Agatha Christie mysteries at like age 8 and 9. I started reading Agatha Christie, or I got into Don Pendleton's Mac Bolan books and was reading military fiction, which is kind of an odd combination of the two. But I could see how that kind of influenced anytime
Sorry.
anytime I
They
sit
don't
down to
speak
write,
in Canada, do they?
that was the Canadian Air Force taking off.
Yeah.
Not to be confused with the Canadian Air Force.
True.
So anytime I sit down, I end up writing a mystery. There's always some form of mystery element to everything I write. So I was wondering what were your earliest influences? What did you start reading for fun that kind of had an influence on you? Again, we'll start with Stephanie, ladies first.
So I'm just going to preface this with, like, I was reading for as long as, like, I can remember. I grew up in a very small town, and my parents hid our TV. So we had a TV, but my mom would put it in, like, the attic and, like, be like, go play outside, go read. Like, she didn't let me watch things. So I read. Like, my town had a post office, a grocery store, and a library, and a giant fairgrounds that got used once a year. And that was it. So I spent so much time at the library reading, and eventually my parents started, when they gave me my allowance, I earned my allowance by reading. So my parents would give me $2 for every book I finished. And it had to be over a certain number of pages, and I had to convincingly be able to tell them about it. So reading was something that I loved. Comics weren't a big thing in my small town, so I read a lot of novels, but, like, I was drawn to, funnily enough, like, I read a lot of, like, nonfiction stuff, like Greek mythology. I was really super drawn to those stories and the myths. But then I also really, like, loved Tamora Pierce, Diane Wynne-Jones, and, you know, like, her books were the basis for, like, Howl's Moving Castle, and, you know, the Christomancy books. And I was, like, super into, like, Philip Pullman, The Golden Compass, and just a lot of, like, fantasy and fiction, and obviously Narnia too. Like, I was big into escapism and, like, the idea of other worlds being within our own world. So that was something that was very, very, very intriguing to me as a kid who wanted to be somewhere else, besides this boring
where they had
town.
comic books.
Yeah, someplace where they had anything, really.
TV.
TV. Yeah, video games. My parents wonder why I'm, like, the, like, pop culture monster I am now, and I'm like, it's because you deprived me of it. But yeah, I was just, like, really into other worlds, and again, specifically kids finding, like, being based in, you know, our world and finding new worlds to explore. That was a very common theme with the things I read as a kid.
All right. Mr. Zahler.
Let's see. My parents used comics as a reward system, and I was growing up. I was reading from like 2.5 on, so I have no, like, a lot of things are a blur. Like, I never remember not being able to read. So as far as books, I know there was a lot of licensed stuff that I read. I read the Dean Foster Star Trek adaptations of the cartoons. I read the James Blish ones, the adaptations of the TV shows. My mom, she was really, you couldn't convince her to buy a toy, but if it was a book, she would get it. So we read a ton of Choose Your Own Adventures. I remember going through a Judy Blume phase because I liked Tales of Fourth Grade Nothing so much. And he had a pesky younger brother, and I have lots of brothers, so I could draw from all of that. The first Star Trek novel I really remember reading, the novel was the Anne Crispin Yesterday's Son, which is just fantastic. And that kind of cemented me there. And then, I mean, I know I read Bradbury, but I think I read a ton of Isaac Asimov. Like, I went through the I, Robot books were just so cool with the short stories and trying to figure out why robots were working the way they did with the 3 laws of robotics. Like in its own way, they were mysteries too, but they were like logic puzzles that I really liked. And that's the big stuff that I started off with. My parents were pretty good about, like, if it was a book I could read it. There was no, nothing was too far above me, nothing was below me. It was just, good that I was reading. And we did the summer reading programs. We did tons of those. Always had books and always had, I gravitated toward light stuff because I knew the characters, and then on to other things.
All right.
I was going to say, isn't everything beneath you at your height, Thom?
Yes. Except Canada, which is technically right above me.
Yeah. That's funny. Canada's beneath me because I'm in Metro Detroit.
Yeah, I'm at like one of the little points of Ontario.
Yeah. Yes. Stephanie is, of course, above me.
Yeah.
So I guess did you want to go into more stuff, Dan, or is this my?
Oh no, I just assumed you were going to tell us about the cave paintings you read.
Oh, I am going to hit you so hard with my flint axe. The old ways are the best ways. Actually, the funny thing is, though, the first book that I remember reading, and this cannot be actually the first book I read, but the first book I remember reading is The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood by Howard Pyle, written and illustrated by Howard Pyle, which everybody goes like, because that is Robin Hood I return to again and again and again. That's the first. Read a lot of. I think Encyclopedia Brown led me directly into Sherlock Holmes, which was a little weird. It's like could have been a interim. There was pretty much nothing in between.
Yeah.
And well, no, that's not true. I was also reading Hardy Boys at that time, but it was like Encyclopedia Brown, Hardy Boys, Sherlock Holmes. Big jump. Because as I keep telling parents, the ones that are still like a little iffy about comic books, always reading 3 levels above my grade, because I was devouring comics right off the bat. So yeah, that was so similar to you, Dan, in that I've been reading a lot of mystery, but I went to Arthur Conan Doyle rather than Agatha Christie.
Yeah, I eventually got to Conan Doyle, and I've read all that. And I remember in high school, I ended up reading a lot of Shakespeare, and I'm probably one of the few high schoolers who read all of Shakespeare, not just because it was an assigned, oh, you have to read Romeo and Juliet. One of my favorite, Macbeth is one of my favorite plays, period, let alone famous, favorite Shakespeare. But I don't remember reading any children's books or books that were geared towards young readers. But, I got into reading comics when I was 5. So like you, Paul, I remember I was always kind of reading above my age group. And I think that's something, I remember going to school and learning mythology and going, well, I already know the Norse mythology because of Stan Lee.
Thor, he's got long blonde hair.
Yeah, Thor and Balder and I know Frigga and all that stuff because they taught us in the comics and certain laws of physics and things like that. And I think that was one of the things that always drew me to comics was the learning. But before we get,
I was going to say, did anybody else like spend huge amounts of money at the Scholastic book fairs?
Yes. That was the only time I really got books because we didn't have bookstores nearby. So it was like the library and Scholastic Book Fair were where I got books.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Scholastic Book Fair. That was the highlight in school, that little paper showed up and you're like, ooh, I want to get this and this and this and this, And if there was a superhero on the cover, hot damn.
So I'd have extra money for the.
I still remember actually like picking up the very first like Harry Potter book at a Scholastic Book Fair, and I would just like normally pick up random things that were just interesting to me, but I remember bringing it home and my mom was just like, "Oh, I heard about this on the CBC." You know, like it's just funny to me now thinking back on like how, I mean, J.K. Rowling, for better or worse, you know, but those books were such a huge thing, and like just thinking about such a, oh, I might have heard of this in such a sidebar kind of way.
I didn't actually come across the Harry Potter books until the first movie came out, and then I just read all of them. And the mouse is what made me realize Rawlings was a really good writer, in that they introduced Scabbers in the first book, and you go along through the whole thing, a rat, mouse, and then suddenly it's Peter Pettigrew, what, 4 books in? And I'm like,
alert, Dan.
Yeah, it's a Prisoner of Azkaban.
yeah. And it's like, this woman really has laid these things out, you know, and that's when you start connecting the dots, and it was above just children's fare, at least in my mind. I mean, they were really good reads, but they were really quick reads. But that's the one that got me, was the amount of work she put in. So, yeah, and I realize she's very problematic now.
But it's like, it's hard to, yeah. It's hard for them to not be a nostalgic part of like my childhood too, you know, like there's some things that, you know, you recognize now as being like, ew, but those were still such a huge part of my, you know, childhood and like coming up and loving reading. Like it's hard to separate them.
Though it did seem like through most of the books you could go, you know, if Harry would just go and tell an adult, so much of none of this would have happened. He would have been fine.
But that's such a traditional children's YA thing, is the kids don't want to go to an adult because they know the adult's going to go, you know, we told you not to say his name.
Yeah.
That's how I ended up in prison at age 8.
Prison being Detroit.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm not the one that lives on in the Mistake on the Lake.
The Mistake on the Lake, Chicago?
No, that's Cleveland.
Oh, okay.
We have a hellmouth.
They have a hellmouth.
Ew.
It's canon.
Completely off topic, but again, flipping through, looking for anything to watch, trying not to do work. Came the show the Grand Tour with the guys from they used to be the BBC's. What was it called over there? What was their first show?
Top Gear.
Oh God.
Top
yes.
Gear. Yeah, love Top Gear. The first episode of season 3 of Grand Tour is all about them wanting to turn Detroit into a driver's amusement park because they think Detroit is completely devastated, and they're driving through all these empty streets in these muscle cars and just building racetracks on this, you know, in an old Cadillac plant. And I just kept thinking of you, Paul, through the whole thing.
Well, the funny thing is that when they do these things, they are very selective.
Yes.
That where they're going.
Yeah, they talk about how they're in the suburbs and it's an empty, you know.
Yeah.
You know.
And you can't beat the editing machine. That was always that Jay Leno thing with jaywalking. You know, he would never show the people who did know who the first president was. That wasn't funny.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
It was actually funny. Jeff Marriott wrote a book set in Detroit, and he was in town, and I gave him like a tour. And the one area I took him through, there's this big area where Quincy Jones used to live. Maybe he's still got a house there, or his family. I'm trying to remember if Quincy Jones is still around. But anyway, it's called the Boston Edison District. Gorgeous thing. But you go 3 blocks over, it's devastated. And we have like areas that are like that, but we also have these gorgeous in the city areas that are still big old houses,
Yeah.
that, you know,
And they did drive downtown for a bit, but it didn't play into their narrative.
yeah,
And they talked about how it was very what's a good term for it? I want to say frou-frou, but very,
upscale.
upscale, not upscale, vegan. Yeah.
Oh,
You have to understand these guys are muscle car state, that type Neanderthal. So they look at anything that's like a Starbucks and they go,
Vanilla Crunch and hippies.
yeah.
Yes.
You're
There you
saying
go.
the
Hippie.
Neanderthals like me and my
Yes.
twin axe.
Yes. So, all right. We kind of got into it a little bit, but what were some of your guys' biggest influence outside of comics? We started talking about J.K. Rowling's. Like I said, Shakespeare was one for me. I started getting more into sci-fi. It's a weird one to mention, but the Mission Earth series by L. Ron Hubbard was,
Really?
it's a great sci-fi series. Nothing to do with Dianetics or any of the Scientology, just the Mission Earth series. I mean, this was a 10-book series that just kept getting bigger and bigger. Every book kept getting bigger and bigger, and it's a fascinating read. But so there was a lot of different. But what were some of your guys' later influences, like in your teen years and going into college? Let's start with Thom this time.
Oh, well, the first one's obvious because I've already talked about it. Star Trek. My dad and I watched the show all the time. It was always on, and I don't know. That was everything for a while that I knew about world building, and I read David Gerrold's World of Star Trek and the making of Star Trek. It gave me like a really good idea of what behind the scenes and creative decisions got made. The World of Star Trek actually lays out a lot of what he did on Next Generation. So it was interesting finding somebody who liked Star Trek and worked on Star Trek and actually said, the captain shouldn't go on as many missions. Maybe we should have the first officer do that. It could be like the away team, the contact team. And then later they would adopt that for the most part. But it was, it gave me a peek behind the scenes where I could see the creative process. Paul's very familiar with my love of Aaron Sorkin, who I think in his own way is TV's Stan Lee, in that he doesn't write the way people talk. He writes the way people wish they talked. But I like the cadence. I think a lot of my love of dialogue comes from him. And then there's a lot of really a big fan of shows that got canceled way too quickly, as I'm sure most of us are, because we've all watched stuff on Fox. But there's a show called Prophet that I adored.
With Adrian
Pasdar. Yes, about a psychopath who grew up in a refrigerator box watching TV shows, and it's actually all based on Richard III, and I think it's brilliant.
Yeah,
and
I remember the show. It was great.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I loved it. Back in the days before the big, before the internet became everything, I managed to track down the episodes that only aired in England and Paris, and get those so I could see them before the DVD set came out, because it was just that show was so good. Yeah, so stuff like that, and I watched a lot of the Glenn Larson stuff, $6 Million Man, like anything that was even remotely science fiction. But it was things like Star Trek. And like you'd see little glimmers of things. So there are things that I'm not fan of completely, but like there were actually like a couple episodes of the Superboy studio that are really good. For the reason of the writers in particular that wrote it. Or I liked a lot of the goofy 80s stuff where you could get away with things like Monsters, which was like a syndicated anthology show, but they were so limited budget, they had to be clever with what they did, and it didn't always work, but when it worked well.
Yeah. You mentioned Aaron Sorkin. I'm a big fan of Aaron Sorkin's. I actually fell in love with his work on Sports Night. is where I first and
There are three of us.
yeah, and
Yes.
the shirt episode, the favorite shirt episode.
Oh, I talk about that all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, that is
You're
probably
wearing
one
my
of
shirt.
the best. Yes, you're wearing my shirt is one of
It-
the best. Yeah, that right there changed how I thought a lot about writing. That one moment when that line dropped, because it was like, that's brilliant. The whole setup that you don't see coming.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing how that stuff happens. Like I was a fan of Sorkin before I knew he was a fan of Sorkin because I had seen A Few Good Men, and I think American President preceded
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Sports Night. But there's also a lot of things that you'll see used once, and it will just hook you like that. Like seeing the shirt and the build up to that, or in Superman Spider-Man, the very first one, there's a panel. Spider-Man drops a tracer on Doc Ock, and you can go back to that scene later, and you can go back to that page and see that you did miss him dropping the tracer. And that's the kind of thing that, like, when you see someone execute something like that, or the shirt, that it starts going in your toolbox, and you're like always chasing being able to do that same thing. And I did it in Love and Capes, because there's a scene in the wedding where you see the entire wedding, and if you look closely, you can see Abby technically from the future in the congregation, but you really have to look for her, and you find out at the end that she goes back to her wedding to watch it. But
Cool.
Because when you're married to the world's greatest superhero, the video replay is not good enough.
yes.
Stephanie, how about you? What are some of your other influences outside of comics?
Yeah, so growing up, again, I didn't really have a TV, but my parents would bring it out for Fridays. So TGIF was one of the things that my parents would decide we could watch together as a family. So that whole lineup of Friday, like Boy Meets World and like Sabrina the Teenage Witch, the Melissa Joan Hart series, is so close to my heart. And in retrospect, I was like, I rewatched it last year during the pandemic. And there's so many little things that I just totally forgot. And I've 100% pulled things from Sabrina that have just been embedded in my brain into my writing, mostly Salem's sarcasm and puns. I love them. So that had a huge, huge, huge influence on me. And again, as I said, no TV for most of the time, but my best friend was also an only child, so we spent a lot of time together and socialized each other. But she was very into anime and manga, so she would buy all of those things. And I know that's technically comics, so I'm cheating kind of, but that was very much something that I read a lot of. She would buy things and be like, all right, I'm done with this, here. And I was just this excited kid to get her hand-me-down books and stories, and Sailor Moon was huge. I'm rewatching that now for the first time since I was a teen, and I'm like, wow, I missed so much. We also had a very, very horrific dub back in the day. But yeah, I'm experiencing all these things again that were so nostalgic to me. But yeah, I guess, in my more later years, like Thom said, there's a lot of shows that got canceled that I find wonderful and delightful. Pushing Daisies is something I come back to all the time. Mm-hmm. And I find that whole aesthetic and just the charm wonderful. Brian Fuller just has such a fantastic way of telling stories. And I don't know if any of you watched that Monsters pilot that he did that didn't get picked up.
I never got to see
but I know of it. Yeah.
It's on YouTube. I highly recommend it. It's very fun. But I really like that vibe and feel, and a lot of those kind of things, Dead Like Me and all that kind of stuff was very up my alley. Wonder Falls too. A lot, the whole Brian Fuller, cast there. But yeah, there's definitely a lot that I just felt kind of deprived of growing up. And in my college years and young adult years, I spent a lot of time just being like, give me all of it. And I worked at a movie store and a CD store specifically so I'd get a discount and be able to kind of just buy everything possible. And I remember, again, my best friend introducing me to Arrested Development for the first time and just being like, is this comedy? What? And it just blew my mind. And I still come back to that too. It's just a delight. So a lot of those things really stuck with me. And the humor, the puns, the bad jokes are like that's my...
I remember catching some episodes of Sabrina, but I would watch it for the oddest reason. Was the guy who voiced Salem, Nikki Pakai? He would also been the sidekick for Dennis Miller when Dennis Miller had a late night show for like a minute, and that stuck in my head. So it was like they connected the two, and it's like, oh well, then obviously, I should watch this some. But the reasons we watch things are all unique. But
Salem is like a very good reason to watch the show.
Oh, he is, and he had all the best lines.
He really did.
So
we're talking about these unusual shows.
Yeah,
and had I realized that Rob Thomas, who wrote Cupid, I think both of them.
Yes, both of them.
Was the guy, if I'd realized that the creator of Cupid had done Veronica Mars, I would have figured out a way to watch Veronica Mars' first run, which I missed it because I did not realize it was that guy behind the show. But then Cupid was Jeremy Piven and Paula Marshall, ridiculously good.
Mm-hmm.
And Thom is even more of a Cupid head than I am.
I certainly do not have rips of any of those episodes.
No, of course not.
Definitely not all of them.
Now, Rob Thomas went on to do the iZombie show, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I always get him
can't
confused.
mention that because it's connected to comics.
Yeah, well, I always get him confused with the lead singer of Matchbox 20.
Who shows up in iZombie?
Yes, he does.
Yep.
I remember that, and when I was still working for Bleeding Cool, I actually covered that. So, all right, Paul, how about you? What are some of your biggest influence outside of comics?
Oh man, sci-fi fantasy. I think the first book that made a real impression on me. Oh gosh, now I'm gonna forget it was originally published as Starman's Son. It was by Andre Norton. I'm trying to think, it was like AD 2021 or something like that. And the version I got at the Scholastic Book Fair. But it was this guy in a post-apocalyptic world. I think it may be the first post-apocalyptic setting I ever saw. And all. Oh, I shouldn't mention this in front of Stephanie. He had a house cat that had pretty much the cats had evolved to the side of like somewhere between a puma and a lynx. So in the cover art, it was a Siamese, but it just looked so cool. This guy on a raft with a pole and this huge Siamese cat crouched down, and like in the background, the remnants, it was all flooded, but you could see the remnants of 20th century buildings. Yeah, I love that. I love that so much. Yeah, Star Trek, obviously. The Rockford Files is a big one for me. I love the Rockford Files. I think that may have been the one that really locked in my fondness for American Private Eyes, as opposed to the kind of stuffy, uptight British, not that like Marple isn't the same as Sherlock, nor is he the same as nor is she the same as Poirot, but they're all kind of got a little bit of, oh well, now we must go on and do our investigating, and Jim Rockford was just such a mess. But always stuck to it, until the end. Of course, I watched the occasional episode of Mannix before I could appreciate its genius, Dan. Comics I was reading early, but yeah, I mean, there was just a lot of good television. Some of the comedies, we're talking, like the Mary Tyler Moore Show. The whole family sat down and watched that. We all watched MASH together, and those are just, incredibly well written shows. Somebody just the other day, I said doing the clown's funeral was probably one of the best, if not the best, episode of a situation comedy ever. Was it Chuckles the Clown?
Chuckles the Clown, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and then later I had to be part of the inspiration for the Giggle Loop episode of Coupling. But I just, I read everything, and I watched a ridiculous amount of TV from the 70s through the 80s. Those, trying to think of other specific shows. I will never forget, there was an episode of Magnum PI where his buddy got blown up in the Ferrari. Somebody was trying to kill Magnum, and his friend started the car, and because he was saying, "Yeah, we're gonna go see the sunrise," and when Magnum caught up with the guy who was a Russian national and had diplomatic immunity, the guy said, "You can't do anything to me," and he started walking along, and Magnum says, "Hey, Ivan, what? Did you see the sunrise?" And then it fades to black, and you hear the shot, and it was just such a good moment of the way they set it up and the way it was shot, but the writing on that was so good. Just that moment where Magnum had to he kept trying to stay the 100% the good guy, but he couldn't do it because he just couldn't stand that this really innocent, kind friend of his had died for him. So,
Oh,
how about you, Dan? Oh,
you made me think of one more quick thing that stuck with me over the years, and it's actually the 20th anniversary of this show. But 6 Feet Under actually was one of the first big dramas I got into, and that finale stuck with me in such a big way. And just like every time I hear that song now, it's like Sia, Breathe Me. Like I get like weepy. Like that was such a powerful episode, and it taught me too about, show don't tell necessarily, because like it's pretty much like there's no dialogue, there's no interaction, it's just a silent montage with the music kind of playing over and watching everybody's inevitable deaths. And it's just spoilers, sorry, you've had 20 years, everyone, but like sorry, no, that just like reminded me of that.
And Paul, you reminded me of all the Stephen J. Cannell stuff. Greatest American Hero is definitely an influence, and Lord knows I love me some Stingray.
I was going to say, you got to mention Stingray.
Yeah. Yep.
Nick Mancuso.
Uh-huh.
But all that stuff, it was just funny and, well done, and played with the format.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned, Paul, the differences between the detectives, and I've got this theory that there's basically 4 types of detectives. There's your Sherlock Holmes, which is your super genius, and they always team him with someone that the audience can relate to, who's only there to be the guy asking, well, how did you do that? Then there is your Nero Wolfe type, which is the genius who, for some reason, can't actually get involved. So you've got the leg man, the the Archie Goodwin, Jake and the Fat Man was that way, those type of things. And Mannix was technically that in the first season because you had all the computers were the genius, and Mannix was the leg man, and then they completely changed it in season 2. Then you've got your force of nature guy, which is your Sam Spade, your Jim Rockford, which is they don't really do a lot of detecting. They just keep pounding on things until something shakes loose. They have bad relations with authorities, and they're always womanizing, and then your final one,
Womanizing, depending.
yeah, and your final one is your Miss Marple, your unassuming detective that just your Columbo, the one more minute,
Yeah, the underestimated detective.
Yeah,
that's their
or Monk is another one.
Yeah,
and I kind of categorize all detectives into those 4 categories. And one of a huge influence on me more recently, and it influenced a lot of the novel series I do, the Lucius Fogg novels, is Rex Stout and the Nero Wolfe series, and specifically the Timothy Hutton A&E series they did.
That was a terrific series.
Oh yeah, I have rewatched that probably 3 or 4 times.
I'm really glad too that Archie Goodwin, after he stopped working for Wolfe, was able to go on to a successful career as an extraordinary comic writer and editor.
Yeah, that's good. I'm glad he was able to find that work, but I really loved that series, and I don't know if I would have done the Lucius Fogg books without that, because that was the starting point for me. Even though I was doing a supernatural urban fantasy set in the past, using the Nero Wolfe format for my detective was that starting point. Just like anytime you sit down and create a detective series, you're basically picking one of those formats to move forward with. So that was a huge influence on me. And, when I sit down to write and it's a first person book, I kind of listen to Timothy Hutton, the cadencing he does as Archie Goodwin, to kind of re-up the voice I want to do for the writing. And then I get back into my character.
Yeah. Although Robert Parker was not 100% sold on Robert Urich as Spencer. Every time I read one of the Spencer novels, it's Urich's voice in my head.
Absolutely.
And it became kind of a archetypal
Bye.
Light cycle.
And then Dashiell Hammett is a huge influence on how I don't know if I actually have been influenced in my writing so much as influenced by people who make me want to write better.
Yeah, I can see that.
I don't know that anybody looks at my stuff and go, oh, he loves Fritz Lieber. I've got a series that I'm sure people are going to say is a Fritz Lieber pastiche. It's not, but still. It's just, I think a lot of it is just, this is so good. How can I, what can I, even just inspiration to apply to what I'm doing.
Yeah. Well, you talked about, Robert Urich is the voice of Spencer for you.
Yeah.
I didn't even know urban fantasy was a genre until I'd already written my first novel and someone told me that's what I had written. So,
really?
And then they kind of said, well, you got to check out this book, and this book. Well, one of them they mentioned was Dresden Files.
Yeah.
And I hadn't read any Dresden Files, but I had seen that short-lived TV series on Sci-Fi.
Oh, with my friend Paul Blackthorne.
Paul's
and
your
my friend, I mean, guy I hosted his panel.
Okay. You guys were friendly during the panel.
We
Yeah.
were. He was quite charming after the panel too.
Well, so in my mind, that's what Dresden looked like.
Yeah.
But I listened to the books. And now I've listened to all 18 novels,
Yeah.
and they're all done by James Marsters, who is fabulous. I mean, by far,
Cyclops?
no, that's Marsden. Marsters,
Spike
Spike from
from
Buffy.
Buffy.
I was just yanking his
But
chain.
he is probably the best audiobook narrator I have ever heard.
Mm.
Just phenomenal. And I know it's him, and I've met him, and I've written something he's acted in the Metal Hurlant episode I wrote.
Yeah.
So, and I've gotten to talk to him about that. So you would think that would kind of change. No, it's still Paul Blackthorne in my mind. It will always be Paul Blackthorne is Dresden to me.
Yeah, that's funny because I had read most of the books before, well, the books up to that point, before I saw that show. And so all the covers have him with long hair. And so when I saw it, I was like, wait. So I have that like mental.
Yeah, all the covers have him in a hat, and he never wears a hat.
And I believe that's actually how the company, the RPG company, Evil Hat, became Evil Hat, because they were doing the Dresden Files RPG.
Yeah, I've got it right behind me here.
They were, talking about how.
And that over my, I can't figure out where I'm putting that frame up there.
Yeah.
That's a Chris McGrath cover for one of the Dresden books.
Like an actual original?
No, it's a lithograph, but.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was like,
dude, I ain't that rich.
Break into your house. I mean, I really think that's great.
So I guess I need to add Jim Butcher to my influences.
It's funny. I was also working on before I found out about Dresden Files, I was working on a urban fantasy, and before I knew that it was urban fantasy, and then Dresden Files came out, and I'm like, oh, I should work harder on this, because obviously it's a thing people are paying attention to.
Yep.
Of course, a lot of times if you're coming from comics, like, genre bending happens all the time, so you don't necessarily think about, oh, what's this called? It's like,
yeah, I've never sat down to write a genre. You know, I mean, my first comic work was horror. Well, not my own public, but I started getting a lot of horror work because I was friends with Steve Niles, and Steve got me a lot of work. I either co-wrote with him or by association with him. And I'm not a horror person. I don't watch horror. I don't read horror. And I've never sat down to write horror. I sit down and write a story with characters, and it's a horror situation is as close as it gets. But, so
I
I've
agree.
never sat down to
Writing is a horror situation.
All right, let's move into comics. First, kind of a speed round question. Do you remember the first comic you read?
No.
Only in the sense of generally, like what it was, but not specifically, if that makes sense.
like a character?
Yeah. Like the only way I could get comics was at the grocery store. So I read Archie digests. Yeah. So that was my treat if I was good and I, let my parents get through the groceries relatively pain-free. It was just like, all right, we're at the checkout. Let's get this. And I would then also sit in the 30-minute car ride back home quietly because I was reading. So,
So Thom, nothing? Don't remember?
No, the first book I'm cognizant of having is there's an issue of Superman called the Man Who Cried Super Wolf. There's 237 or something like that. It's got a Nick Cardy cover. I still have it. That's the point that I can look at where my collection started. But I know just from when that came out that I had comics before that, and there are comics in my collection before that. But Also, there were more flea markets I would go to, and I'd get older comics. But Superman's the character I remember like being around most. But my dad read comics too, so and he was when I was pretty young, he was in the hospital for some minor operation, but he had to stay overnight, and my mom bought him comics, and like those became part of my stuff that I just, I have the first appearance of Terror Man because he had that. And I know that wasn't for me, but it just was, it became part of the thing that I had.
Yeah. How about you, Paul? You remember the first book?
I don't. The first book I remember, and I can't remember the issue number now, but it was Stan Lee, John Romita, Captain America, where the bad guy was the Gray Gargoyle, and he took over the Shield helicarrier so he could go steal Compound X, which was an explosive. First book I remember buying myself was Captain America 154 with the evil cap of the 50s, which is why you will constantly hear me complaining about there's this one piece of marketing art that they use all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's cool, Sal Buscema Captain America, but I'm always like, that's the evil cap of the 50s. And people are just like, what? And actually, and I still have it, but it's in horrible condition. I have Amazing Spider-Man 96, which was the issue without the Comics Code stamp, because the anti-drug
Right.
government agency asked, I don't think it was the DEA at the time, but asked Stan Lee to do an anti-drug story, and then the Comics Code went, you can't do that. It says you can't mention drugs. And Stan says, but it's in a negative light. They said, it doesn't matter. And he went, eh, and put it out anyway.
Yeah.
Boy, I wish that was in good condition now. Or even fair. I don't know. Just, it was, that's, but so Marvel superheroes very, very early on, which I'm surprised, because I almost thought it would have been Batman, because the reruns of the
Adam West
Batman reruns started almost immediately after Batman went off the air. So and when you're a kid, that seems like the most awesome show around.
It does. It absolutely did. And then we grew up and went, oh my God.
That's an unusual.
See this surprises me, because I kind of thought people would know, because I know the first book I read.
What is your first book, Dan?
Captain America 189. I was 5 years old. My Uncle Dave showed up, and my Uncle Dave always showed up with gifts. That was his thing. And it used to be like play school. Used to be play school sets. And then he showed up out of the blue traveling, didn't have time to go to a toy store. So he stopped at a 7-Eleven, bought comics for me and my brother. My brother never read his. I think I ended up with that one as well. It was a Nick Fury comic. But I remembered the comic because I remembered this 2-page splash of Cap and Falcon in these like lights. They were trapped in these lights that came down. Mm-hmm. And after I got older, I was able to figure out which book it was. And I remembered Frank Robinson's art. Didn't know who Frank Robinson was, but tracked it down to be Cap. What?
Robbins, I think. Frank Robbins.
Yeah, Frank Robbins. Did I say Robinson?
You said Robinson. Sorry. My mistake.
I might have. Frank Robbins, you're right. So, who was also the Invaders artist, I believe.
Yep.
But yeah, so I kind of assumed comic people just knew their first book.
But was that the first comic you ever had?
Yes.
Okay. So, like, they were just always in, like, for me, knowing when my first comic was is like knowing when I first met my parents. Like, I just have no memory of it because they were always there.
House full of them, yeah.
Because
That makes sense.
like I went to
Oh no, I only
a
had the two
barber-
parents, but I had lots of comics.
Yeah,
Are you sure?
I
Pretty
did.
sure.
Yeah.
You were
I
young at
had
the time.
my barbershop had comics.
Hmm.
And sometimes the barber would just go like because if you were good and because he got new comics every week or every month, he'd just go like, "Oh, take one. Have him take one." So I'm, like I don't think it was my first comic, but like I remember vaguely a Fantastic Four issue that I took home. But
Yeah.
yeah, they were just always around. So
Yeah. Now, like,
It's just like,
I'm-
again, like, oh, sorry.
oh no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, it was more like my parents aren't comic people at all, right? And libraries, up until fairly recently, didn't really carry comics at all. And, like, I didn't have any access to it. I lived in a rural area. So it was just about accessibility for me, like I was aware of comic things, but I think, like, technically speaking, my first kind of introduction to comic books properly was like X-Men the animated series and Batman the animated series. So like those were in kind of conjunction with the Archie stuff. So like I was aware of comic stuff, but Archie was the only thing I really had any access to. And then when I was in like college and I had access to stores and I'd moved to Toronto, the X-Men books that were obviously the X-Men animated series were based off of were the first things that I bought to kind of just like read and actually, experience myself outside of like the manga I would read in hand-me-down style.
Well, do you
I can
guys
hear that.
remember the first time you actually stopped to see who made the book you were reading?
Kind
When
of.
when did the light switch come on that went from, oh, these are just fun comics, to there are people that do this?
There's it's the second Vartox appearance in Superman, but there was a point when I finally, like, I had stacks of comic books, and the first artist I really learned to recognize was Kurt Schaffenberger, because he drew the S Shield differently.
Yeah.
And being a lettering guy, of course, I'm drawn to the way letters look. But when I saw that, that's when I started noticing that artists signed their work, and that people were named in this. You always saw that people made the story, but it's when you started connecting. When I could look at a stack of Superman comics and go, "Oh, that's Kurt Schaffenberger. That's Kurt Schaffenberger. That's Kurt Schaffenberger," and have that moment where, you started knowing that people, you realize that it was actual people making it, and that they were different in some way. It wasn't just like a house style.
Okay.
I think I realized almost immediately when I started reading Marvel stuff, because Stan always did the credits thing, and so even the credits were fun. So, but I don't know that I started recognizing people necessarily, but I did realize, oh, hey, people did this. But I like back when you were reading Archie's, did they even have the credits?
Yeah, I don't really recall. I'm sure they did. But like, again, I was definitely aware of people writing books. Like I've wanted to be a writer for like kind of as long as I can remember, like I've been writing and working on things. So like I knew there was people behind the stories. But I don't know that I was necessarily like super mindful of it at all times. Like I knew specific things, again, like more novel wise, like Golden Compass and like Narnia and those big name books that came in box sets and stuff, and it's like, oh, this is like a series, this is somebody's works. But I don't know that, like, I don't know when I started really kind of connecting the dots and like recognizing work like Thom. I don't know at what point that would have been, really.
For me, I had two things that kind of clicked it for me. One was, and I don't know which one happened first. I knew the names, but Frank Miller on Daredevil, specifically, I think it was the issue was called Cat's Paw, and just the way he started drawing, where you'd see like trace versions of Daredevil that were all like just pinkish, faded out to show motion, because that was such a unique thing. I'm like, wait a minute, this isn't in any other book I've seen. Where'd this come from? You know, and to me, that's the first time I recognized it. And then going to my first convention at 11 years old, 10 or 11 years old, and having my buddy Gil, my mom had a coworker named Gil, who you probably have all seen. He's a cosplayer, and he's been cosplaying for 20 some odd years. Before cosplaying was big, he was the guy running around San Diego Con dressed as Homer Simpson.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Well,
I was terrified you were going to say he's the one that wears the cardboard Optimus Prime gun.
No, he's the Homer Simpson. But he took me to this convention, and he walked me up to this table, and I got an autograph from Walter Koenig, and I got an autograph from Carolyn Monroe. This is right around the time Moonraker came out. But he walked me up to this table and said, "This is a comic book artist. You should, go up and get his autograph." And I went, okay, and he gave me a book. Well, the artist was Jack Kirby.
Oh.
And Jack was just so nice. And I just got such a great feeling off of just talking to the guy. At 10, 11 years old, and he it's like everything else stopped. And it was just that moment. And he signed the book for me, and I immediately went, I need to get more signed by him. And I ran around the convention center trying to find other Kirby books. And somebody turned me on to the Black Panther series he did. So I was able to get all 15 issues, even though he didn't do the last 3. And then when I went running back to his table, he had left. He was done. But Gil saw him heading for the escalator. This was in the basement of the Biltmore Hotel. So I ran after him. I catch him in the lobby, and he had just ran into an old friend. And they were catching up, and I ran up with this stack of books. And Jack just smiled and found a nice place to he could put the books on, and sat there, and I unbagged each one. He signed it, and his friend put them back in the bag. And we did this little conveyor line of 15 books that Jack signed all of them for me. And I walked out of there going, comics is the greatest thing ever. And from that point on, it was all about the people working on the books. Yeah. So
I got that, just like, I think it's such a wonderful experience, and like kids experiencing comics for the first time. I got my first like fan letter from a kid like a couple of weeks ago, and it made my whole world. Like it just, and I sent her a little like book back and everything. And I sent her like a little original drawing, and her parents actually messaged me this morning to say she got it. And they're like, you've made her whole year. But like, it's so magical to like have that interaction. And comics and conventions are actually such a fascinating way to have this opportunity to interact with creators in a way that you wouldn't necessarily think is possible as like a young kid. And then it's just like this unprecedented access to them, and it can change your whole world. Like it's amazing. And the fact that you got that with Jack Kirby, what?
Oh yeah. I mean, when you're young and you're reading comics, these are rock stars to you. These are, Aaron Sorkin, Jack Kirby, they're all on the same level. I mean, these is, Gene Simmons is up, it's all up there in the same level. And then, when you get older, you start realizing, okay, these are just real people, and, they're just doing a job. And, Jack was slaving at his desk most of the time, and Roz was trying to reel him in from giving away the store to the people because he was a nice guy. So, all right, let's get to the comics themselves. Again, for me, I look at Chris Claremont's run on X-Men as kind of the quintessential building a universe, laying out plot threads, and just laying it out. But at the same time, I think Peter David really influenced me and allowed me to, showed me that it was okay to be funny, to have humor in the books, where Claremont didn't really come across funny. It was always very soap opera. This was the General Hospital of comics, was the X-Men. I remember reading X-Force, and the first X-Force book he did, where they're passing around a mayonnaise jar, and all of these superpowered people can't open the mayonnaise jar. But it's a background thing going on through the whole episode as they're talking about what this new team is going to be. And it's finally the non-powered normal person that just bangs it on the table and opens the mayonnaise jar. And that just struck me as, okay, that influenced me a lot in how I tried to ground my stories, put humor in, all of that. So I figured those two may be some of the biggest influence on the way I write. How about you guys? What comic writers have really, or any comic creators? I think Kirby counts as a big influence on me just because of the way he treated me when I met him. But who are the comic creators who have influenced you the most? Stephanie?
Yeah, so, like I write middle grade right now, primarily. I do like some YA too, but I went through a huge kind of, I don't know, just like marathon reading of everything I could kind of get my hands on for kind of more modern stuff. So like Paranorthern is coming out second in my book, whatever here, but like it was sold first and it was done way first. It's just publishing's weird. But like, Noelle Stevenson and Lumberjanes and Nimona and things like that were just, they showed me that you could be so funny with your writing and add in little bits of yourself to the story. And, I read a bunch of web comics too. There was one, and it went on to also be published. It's called Cucumber Quest by Gigi DG. And I just went through all of these things that I was just completely tickled by, because like there was a really long period where kids comics, like Spider-Man, Superman, Batman, nobody was making those for kids anymore. Like it was all, more catered to the older audience that had grown up with those characters. So that was just really lacking. So I went to the other publishers and other creators that were doing things for younger audiences and kind of just zeroed in on that. And then I know we're talking comics specifically, but I just find there's a lot of really quality cartoons and animated things out there right now too. And Gravity Falls by Alex Hirsch was a huge influence on me in writing middle grade specifically. Like, I don't know if any of you have seen Gravity Falls, but it's a masterpiece. Like, it's a genuine masterpiece. It probably in my top 10, not just animated series of all time, like best series of all time. Like they have so many characters and everything at the end comes together and every single character has an arc. And that just blows my mind. Like, it blows my mind. So a lot of those things really kind of just influenced the writer I wanted to be. And again, thinking back on things like Sabrina, I really just like jokes and like puns. Paranorthern is technically Paranorthern and the Chaos Bunny a hopcalypse. And like every kind of little bit I could stick in there. It's just fun for me. But, there's Faith Erin Hicks did The Adventures of Superhero Girl with Dark Horse. And that was just another thing that really stuck with me in terms of humor and kind of also mixing slice of life. And yeah.
All right. Thom.
Well, obviously the biggest is kind of obscure. Same as Paul the Storrie. I read his work and then I say I should do the opposite of that.
Yes,
So,
it's very
good
interesting.
plan.
yes.
Yeah, that's an excellent plan.
Yes. Jerry Conway was the first writer who he wrote what I think are comic books. Like, I'm still convinced Justice League 200, it's not the greatest comic book ever written, but it is the most comic book ever written. It's just like everything a superhero comic is in Justice League 200. And he wrote one of my favorite characters, Firestorm. But he wrote the 70s, 80s run of Justice League before coming back to the Detroit era. And especially in Firestorm, he really broadened out my idea of what superhero or what comics could do.
Mhm.
He did an entire issue that's all in Ronnie Raymond's mind when he sees his father get killed, which I still think is brilliant. And there's misdirects in it and surprises. And it's just, not only did he kind of set the ballpark for what comics were for me, but then he showed that you could go up a notch or change things, which was, that expands you out too. Because I had the same thing you did, Dan, with Peter David, where he was one of the first writers who was really using humor. And I mean, he did it really well in Hulk. He had the advantage in Hulk that nobody was reading it, so he could really mess around. But when you see someone, he made a point in some interview when he was doing the Star Trek comic where he said, I can't really do cool aliens because you can do all sorts of stuff in comics and nobody notices it. And I can't do cool battles because we can do anything in comics and you don't really notice it. But I can do humor, and that's something the series used to do really well. And I can bring that to it in a way that wasn't done before. And I thought he had a lot of really good, beats in his Star Trek comic. Along the same lines, when I was at the Kubert School, I got introduced to the works of Kyle Baker, and that was completely different to me. Cowboy Wally is probably a bigger influence on my work than I realize, just because like a lot of how I look at humor comes from him, and actually comes from Berkeley Breathed on Bloom County, and Bill Waterston and a lot of the comic strip guys, because like when I did Love and Capes, I went to a 4-panel joke format where every fourth panel is a beat or has a joke, and it's kind of like this comedic metronome. But I grew up reading so many of those things that thinking in a 4-panel grid is just, it's like second nature. It like the jokes are almost built in that way, and I have to figure out a way to make them not that way if I'm writing something different. It just got so ingrained in me. And the other one that jumps to mind, not counting, no, I'm going to do two, because even though I was going to rule out people that I've known personally, because I've been lucky enough to know a bunch of other writers and artists who influenced me by helping me as well as being good writers, like Tony Isabel and Bob Ingersoll. But they kind of have a thumb on the scale because they personally helped me. James DeMatteis, who I think everything he writes is just brilliant and soulful, and he can do just about anything. And like he does all sorts of great stuff, and then he does Craven's Last Hunt and just blows your doors off. And Darwin Cooke. I think his stuff is just phenomenal. And, I have on my desk back there a copy of New Frontier, just because it's kind of like an art Bible. Like when I really get lost, that's what I reach for, because it's just so brilliant.
Yeah. Darwin Cooke was amazing. I got to meet him twice, but the second time, I watched him fanboy out meeting Michael Golden.
Okay.
Which was interesting. It's like, because you look at these guys and you kind of put them on a pedestal, and then suddenly you realize they're just, like I said, normal guys who have other people on pedestals. And
yeah. Darwin, in my studio here is a cover that Darwin did for Love and Capes.
Nice.
I love that thing so much. In my head, Darwin always sounded like Phil Hartman's Frank Sinatra impression. I got him to do the cover because Chris Ryle, when he was at IDW, said, "Oh, you should do some alternate covers. Who do you want?" I'm like, "You're working with Darwin Cooke now. Ask him." So he did. And then the response is, "Tom's a great kid. I'd love to do it." So
nice. Mr. Storrie.
Darwin offered me the very first DC comic I ever did was Batman Beyond 23 of the original series. And we were at a party. I ran into Darwin, said, "Oh man, that cover was great." He's like, "Yeah, drop me a line. I'll give it to you." I'll send it to you. And I never did because I just felt like taking food out of his mouth, because but he did that all the time apparently. Um, but I have a few questions before I jump into my influences. Now, Dan, you said Chris Claremont's run on X-Men. Now, did you mean his run on X-Men, or did you mean run on X-Men?
Yeah.
Because he had some pretty solid.
Yeah, there's still
Well,
some plot threads that have never been answered. I know. Like,
yeah.
yeah.
I believe Dan is saying that Chris Claremont is the best he is at what he did, and what he did wasn't always very nice.
No, very true.
So, and Stephanie, did you ever read the Nameless City books that Faith Erin Hicks did?
Yes. Yeah. She's so great. And I recently, she's such a fantastic storyteller. And like, I just read her latest book, 1 Year at Ellesmere. I was asked to curate a list of like Canadian graphic novels, like for middle grade. I'm like, I'll do middle grade. There are not a lot of middle grade Canadians doing Canadians doing middle grade comics. So I really struggled with this and had to like figure. But anyways, Faith Erin Hicks is amazing, and she has such a natural way of like doing youthy dialogue. Like, sometimes like I'm writing stuff and I'm like, how do kids sound? How do kids talk? Is this natural? Do people talk like this still? And like, I'll find myself like, when I still took the bus in the not Panini times, like would be like listening to like kids on their way to school being like, how do they interact with each other? But like, I read Faith Erin Hicks's work, and she's one of those creators that is so good at dialogue to me and makes everything flow so well and doesn't sound like a millennial trying to like sound like a kid, which can be harder than it probably seems.
I think I think Nameless City actually has influenced me in terms of like a fantasy comic that I'm doing. Just the way she did it, I went, oh, I should take notes, because it was just so good. But generally speaking, I am so old school. Possibly because I'm old. That was for you, Thom. Stan Lee influenced me a lot. A lot of people are, but the artist plotted it and stuff. Yeah, but the cadence and a lot of times the kind of joie de vivre that was for you, Stephanie, because I wanted to do Canadian content.
Yeah, some French.
Yeah. But I just, the way he did dialogue, it was punchy, it had energy, but he could also do, like, he could drop into Reed Richards doing Star Trek pseudoscience babble, and you're like, wow, that really sounds smart. And it's like, no, it's pretty much just confusing, but it's good. Roy Thomas, particularly his run on Conan, but I mean, all his superhero stuff was great, but the stuff he did on Conan, especially since I've ended up doing adaptations of things along the way, he taught me a lot about how to adapt rather than regurgitate, which is easy to fall into. Steve Englehart was writing Captain America when I started buying it at the drugstore, so it wasn't regular. But I've had the pleasure of talking to Steve Englehart at a couple of shows, and just really talented guy, really nice guy. And it just had two more of those. Marv Wolf and Len Wein, I think, influenced me and had the pleasure of getting to know them. I'm going through a huge list, but it'll be over. Then Doug Mensch for his work on Werewolf by Night more than anything else. He then did Moon Knight, and of course he did great Batman stuff. But what I really loved was his Werewolf by Night. I realized that Chaykin really influenced me from his American Flag. Kind of like busted my brain out of. I had read non-superhero comics up to that point. Obviously, I read Werewolf by Night, but they were all kind of from the superhero publishers. And Chaykin's American Flag came along, and I was like, I'm not really comfortable with this because he's not really. I should have been old enough to catch on, but I was like, it took me a second to go, wait, this is not a superhero book. This is an action adventure sci-fi. And it helped me just kind of tweak my brain out of comic superheroes. And then so those I think those are some of my major influences. Actually, I remember Louise Simonson, her run on Power Pack was also one of those things where you kind of like, oh, you can have a whole different voice than just the kind of boom, boom, boom action stuff. I mean, there was plenty of action in Power Pack, but the kids' interactions and their perspective were so different than anything else that we had seen. You know, in the Marvel universe. So, how about you, Dan? Who do you feel like you have direct influences or indirect influences?
Oh, I think I mentioned a lot, but you mentioned Steve Englehart, and it makes me flash back to this tiny convention I did in San Jose. I got to do a panel on writing with Steve.
Oh, nice.
And turns out he and I approach writing completely differently. Because I write, I always say I write characters. I get to know the characters in my head well enough. I put them in a scenario and I kind of let them act it out and I take notes. And Steve's like, what are you doing? You come up with your scenario and you tell the characters to do what you want them to do. And we had this little debate going on back and forth. And that was pretty much the length of the panel, is that just him and I debating back and forth whether characters should drive or the story or the scenario should drive it. The scene should drive it. And we completely disagreed through the entire panel.
Well, I mean, you know, the characters hopefully help you to figure out the plot.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think it's a little bit of both. Yeah. Like, it's like, for me, I have an idea of the story and then I have a good idea of the characters. And I want the story to be flexible enough that as I get to know the characters better, the story can adapt as they speak to me. And they're just like, you know what? I think I'd do this instead. So, like, I don't know. It's a little bit of both.
No, Steve was straightforward story.
Yeah.
You're telling the story he wants to tell, regardless of the characters are like, this isn't me. What's going on? Nope.
Well,
but that makes sense based on.
Yeah,
I was going to say that makes sense based on his Justice League run, because he didn't have complete control over the characters. He could do stuff with the ones who didn't have regular books, but like if he needed Wonder Woman to act really horribly to the Justice League, it's going to move the plot, so he's going to do it.
Yeah.
Yep.
But hey,
our fifth guest tonight.
500 degrees, but she would like to be held.
I just really quick, Dan. You were talking about the, you know, people fanboying out, you know, creators fanboying out. One of my favorite moments at any convention was watching Jamal Igle, who is a wonderful guy but a tremendous creator, and Jose Luis Garcia Lopez was walking by, and Jamal jumped out from behind his booth and tried to introduce himself and tell him, Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, how much he meant to him. What proceeded to happen was Jamal going, you, and his friend Keith comes out from behind the booth and literally translates. Jamal just wanted to say that you're like a hero of his. He loves your work. He admires you so much. And Jamal's like, yeah. I've never seen him at a loss for words, but Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, and that was like, boom. He was a wonderful thing to watch. For the sweetness of the moment, not because he wasn't embarrassing himself. I think Jose Luis Garcia Lopez was a little embarrassed. Like, oh my gosh. Probably like, this is the 20th person who has gone speechless of me today. But
I got to watch
Thom all the time.
I got to watch our friend Tone get like that around Michael Golden.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I love Michael's artwork, but to me, he's an artist. And, so Tone is like gaga over him. Well, I got to sit there and talk music with him. We were at a Thai food place down in L.A., and they were showing Woodstock on this big screen next to our table. So he and I were sitting there talking about Jimi Hendrix's performance, just having a great old conversation, nothing to do with comics. And Tone is like this for the entire thing.
I'm sorry. When you said Woodstock, I assumed you meant from Peanuts.
No, the musical festival, from when you were about, 30?
Oh, no, that was the one from the 90s, right? Where it was just people fighting each other.
Okay, speed round here. I got 2 last questions. Autographs. Who have you gotten autographs from, or who have you actually stood in line to get an autograph from?
Danny O'Neill.
Good choice.
Man, I mean, I can think of actors real easy, but Gil Kane was one of the first people I got an autograph from. He did a creation convention, and it's weird because I didn't like his work, but he drew the cover of the Superboy issue that my Dial H for Hero character appeared in, so I needed it signed.
So you've worked with Gil Kane?
Yes, I've worked with Gil Kane. Harlan Ellison I've waited in line for. Man, there aren't many. Because also at this point, like, I feel like when you do enough conventions, you wind up being able to slip behind them and not wait in line as much. I mean, I waited in line to get William Shatner to sign the copy of My Little Pony that had his pony in it. Oh, and I got Weird Al Yankovic to sign the My Little Pony that had cheese sandwich in it, and meeting him he was a genuine delight.
Amazing. That was the last concert I think I saw before this all went down. So
yeah,
well, one of the last, yeah. I don't know. I think like Thom, like I think I've just kind of, if there's anything I've either been at conventions and I could just wait until there wasn't a line, or I could do that. But I do have like a couple like signed books by Neil Gaiman. And then I think like I waited in line. And again, this was like more specifically waiting for people to not be around. Cause like I have a cat sketchbook where it's just like, I have a bunch of people who've drawn cats. Thom has drawn a cat in it, actually.
I had to do mine on a separate sheet of paper.
Yes, and it's tucked in. But I had this sketchbook. So I have like one of Bruce Timm did one for me.
Oh, nice.
And I also have like a very small Mignola one. So that was like kind of more waiting for like an absence of people to be around, because I knew they would not do sketches if there were other people in the line. Mm-hmm. So they're very like quick doodles, but like I knew it would be a hard no if there were others. So yeah.
Yeah, 'cause they don't want to set that precedent at that
Yeah.
point.
And I didn't want to like make them feel like obligated either or anything, but like I waited and asked, and so I have little doodles by them.
All right. I think we're going to wrap it up there. We're at our 90-minute mark.
And Dan's lungs are giving out. So
Yeah, this was wrong pipe, not the pneumonia.
Oh, good.
So,
Well, I mean, not good, but you know
Yeah.
what I mean.
yeah, no, that would have been
Yeah, you
completely
almost
different.
choked.
So, by the way, the only other person I ever stood in line for besides Jack Kirby was Jim Valentino when Image
Oh.
first started.
Yeah.
And then years later, not only did I get to work with Valentino, I got to work on Shadowhawk, the book I got him to sign. So that was
So
kind
now
of
have
fun.
you gone back and signed over Jim?
I haven't. No. But I want to thank you guys for joining us, both of you. It's been an absolute treat. Stephanie, it's lovely to meet you.
Yeah, great to meet you too.
Tom, it's great to see you again.
Good to see you.
Also, you both sound like you have books coming up. I do a show during the week on the comic shopping experience. It's an hour show. I do it Tuesday and Wednesdays at 2 Pacific, whatever that equals in your time zone, or on Thursdays at 6 Pacific. And it's an hour, like I said, it's an hour show. Either one of you guys are welcome on anytime. Just give me a heads up. I'll have you on and we can talk about whatever you got coming up. So
Okay.
just let me know.
Thank you.
Paul, thank you for joining me once again.
Always a pleasure, Dan.
And everybody, next week we will be probably talking about Loki because that'll be back.
Woo!
And we'll have that to talk about. So, and again, both Tom and Stephanie, you guys are welcome back anytime. If you want to talk about Loki, that's, whatever the big Disney Plus series is usually our main topic.
Okay.
But we're filling in because of the Bad Batch is good, but it's not epic. It's not event level, and that's kind of what we do. So
I like it fine, but Dan's all in it.
I liked it
And
better
you
than
didn't like-
Modoc.
You didn't.
It's Star Wars, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Star Wars.
Yeah.
Now,
I'm
where
actually-
can people find you online? Easy.
Yes.
Oh.
Tom.
You guys.
You can find me at you can find me at Thom Zahler, ThomZahler. And I have a Patreon, patreon.com/Thom Zahler, where you can get new Love and Capes every week.
Nice. Stephanie?
My website is stephaniecooke.ca, like the lovely spelling you see here in my name. And then I'm on Twitter and Instagram, etc. At Hello Cookie is me. I will ramble about just about anything on Twitter. So
Very cool. Paul, where can they catch you up? Storyville?
Storyville.com, at Storyville on Twitter. Easiest places to reach me.
All right. And me, I am my name everywhere. Just Dan Wickline on Instagram, on Facebook. Anywhere you look, you can just find me. So, because, as my ex-girlfriend of 35 years out of the blue popped up last week said, you're real easy to find online. So,
I had somebody actually ask me, oh, I saw these comics that were by Paul Storrie, and I wonder if they were by you. And I thought, well, it's really easy to find me on, find out that stuff online, or former high school. I always wondered what happened to you, but I couldn't find you. Really? If you type Paul Storrie in.
yep. So, yeah. Like I said,
The advantage
35
of
year
a
old, haven't
weird
talked for
name.
35 years, popped up. Like, oh, man. All right, guys. Thank you again. I will
Sure.
see you all. I'll see Paul. I'll see you next week.
Yep.
Hopefully, I'll see you guys at convention soon.
All right. Yeah.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Good night.
bye.
Right.